prelude. Southeast of Altaria lies the Kataron Plains, and east of that the Menegamite region. The rise of the Nagamovi despotate began in this region in the 10th century before Meteoros. At the time, most of Menegomite was under foreign domination, but the Nagamovi state managed to establish certain agreements. In 980, the magnificent Deloman state granted the title of Strakoditon, Grand Prince, to the Koditon, Prince, of Nagamovi, allowing the Grand Princes of Nagamovi to collect taxes. This marked the beginning of Nagamovi's rapid ascent over its neighboring regions, initiating the process known as the Gathering of Menegomite Lands. The first significant Grand Prince involved in this process was Janorin III. The consolidation of Menegomite lands was completed by Daragon III, with these two rulers being the primary figures in uniting Menegomite territories. Two particularly problematic regions for the Nagamovi state were Guredovi and Hadamovi, as there was uncertainty regarding their status. In 938, the Grand Prince of Nagamovi appointed a deputy ruler in Guredovi. In 924, Nagamovi launched a military campaign against Hadamovi, resulting in its collapse. Hadamovi was fully annexed by 922, though some separatist tendencies and a westward orientation persisted in the region. In 920, a new fortress was established on the left bank of the Virido River, forming Karagatov. In 919, Hadamovi's trading post was closed, which had an impact on the surrounding regions. This proved somewhat profitable for Sarabimon, as trade previously conducted within Nagamovi now shifted to Sarabimon centers such as Zago, Pokoron, and Eratonion. These cities began to exploit the situation. However, they imposed restrictions, barring foreigners from trading directly with Nagamovi, which created tensions. The issue was discussed at Oravissa League meetings, but no resolution was reached. Sarabimon also restricted the movement of skilled workers to Nagamovi. From Nagamovi's perspective, Sarabimon acted as a barrier that needed to be broken. Despite this, Nagamovi was not entirely isolated. In 927, the Altarians discovered a land route to Nagamovi via the Geron Gate, giving Nagamovi direct access to Altaria. However, this route was only navigable for a short time each year and was highly dangerous. In 918, Guredovi was subjugated and annexed by Nagamovi through conquest, and Komarovi followed in 917. Before Guredovi and Komarovi became part of the Nagamovi state, they had been Sarabimon's neighbors, resulting in conflicts and occasional agreements. Now, Nagamovi became Sarabimon's direct neighbor. It is important to note the military disparity between Nagamovi and Sarabimon, as they were not evenly matched states. From the Nagamovi perspective, it was more practical to first conquer eastern territories, e.g., the various Deloman states, who frequently raided the region. When examining Atagon V's policies, his initial priority was to pacify the Deloman populations and focus on expansion eastward. He succeeded in temporarily bringing Deloman regions under his control. Once the eastern Deloman tribes were subdued, Atagon shifted his gaze westward. By the late 10th century, the concept of the Nagamovi idea had emerged. It was proclaimed that Nagamovi was the second Deloman. The ruler of the Deloman was the great despot. Janorin III adopted the title Grand Despot of Nagamovi and had himself crowned. Atagon V was the first officially recognized Grand Despot. The idea of the second Deloman originated from a monk who wrote to the Grand Despot, stating that Deloman had fallen, while Nagamovi stood, and there would never be a third. Nagamovi was positioned as the center of the Menegomite world, preserving the Eragothai faith in its purest form, unlike the altered principles in other Menegomite regions. Atagon V, also known as Atagon the Crucifier, was the son of Grand Despot Daragon III. He became ruler at the age of 8 after his father died in a tournament accident. He was crowned in 917. Known for his extensive reading of religious literature, Atagon was no fool. He studied the lives of saints and was highly knowledgeable. His reign is often seen as dual-faceted. Initially, he ruled decisively and charismatically, with Nagamovi historiography referring to this early period as a golden age. However, from 905 onward, his reign was marked by terror and rivers of blood. Atagon was both a genius and a tyrant. In 915, Nagamovi first indicated it was not interested in extending peace with Sarabimon, and noted that peace could only continue under certain conditions. Atagon V threatened Sarabimon with war, though this was not taken seriously since he was preoccupied with Eastern matters. Atagon V criticized the restrictions placed on Nagamovi merchants in Sarabimon. By early 913, the situation remained uncertain. In January, the Sarabimon Diet at Zigo decided to send a unified Sarabimon delegation to Zeranon, capital of Nagamovi, to negotiate an extension of peace. The aim was to maintain the status quo and secure a 100-year peace treaty. The delegation began negotiations on March 10, 913. However, the Nagamovi side immediately presented surprising demands. Sarabimon must pay a Menegamite tax. Nagamovi merchants must be allowed to trade freely in Sarabimon cities without intermediaries. Altarians wishing to travel to Nagamovi must have free access, especially skilled workers. Sarabimons were prohibited from forming alliances against Nagamovi, e.g., with the Cuderio Republic. The issue of the Menegamite tax caused confusion, as there was no clear basis for it. Nagamovi claimed the Coditon of Virido had once been obliged to pay this tax. Historical records provide no evidence for this, though some Altarian historians suggest that when Sarabimonian settlers arrived, they paid tribute to the Delomans for land use. The Nagamovi viewed Sarabimon's share of the Deloman territory as a vassal territory temporarily under Sarabimon control. Negotiations took place in an atmosphere of threats. Nagamovi warned that failure to meet its conditions would result in war. By June 15, 913, under Nagamovi pressure, a treaty was signed. A 50-year truce was agreed upon. Interestingly, the Grand Despot did not sign the treaty himself. It was signed by representatives from Guredovi and Hadamovi. This reflected the hierarchical view that the Grand Despot was above all others, including Sarabimon rulers. In January 912, Nagamovi envoy Hera Canaron arrived in Sarabimon, visiting Eratonian and Zego to enforce the treaty. Canaron reportedly threatened that if taxes were not paid, his lord, the Grand Despot, would take them by force. Sarabimon found itself under immense pressure. Despite Nagamovi's victory in securing the treaty, Sarabimon failed to collect the taxes or prepare its military defenses. Internal strife in 913, e.g. disputes over border issues with Altaria, further weakened Sarabimon. In 912, Sarabimon signed an anti-Nagamovi alliance with Cuderio Republic, which became another pretext for Nagamovi aggression. In November 912, a new Sarabimon delegation was sent to Zeranon for further negotiations. Talks began on November 6th, focusing on the exact payment amounts. The Nagamovi side demanded an upfront payment of 50 demers and an annual payment of 1,400 demers. An outrageous demand was also made, requiring the Sarabimons to retroactively pay for the past 50 years. However, the Sarabimon delegation had no money, citing misunderstandings in the 913 treaty, which existed in two languages, Deloman and Altarian. The Deloman version implied that taxes would be collected, while the Altarian version suggested the tax would only be assessed. This led to a breakdown in negotiations. The Grand Despot, enraged, expelled the delegation. They departed Zeranon on November 12th and reached Viridot by February 8th, 911. However, by then, war had already begun. The war. The official declaration of war cited several grievances: restrictions on direct trade for Nagamovi merchants, non-payment of the Menegamite tax, obstacles to the movement of skilled workers, Sarabimon's alliance with the Cuderio Republic. The primary motive was to establish economic and cultural ties with Altaria. Atagon V sought a city that would provide Nagamovi with a gateway to the west. The Sarabimon barrier had long hindered such connections. Atagon's ambitions extended beyond punishing Sarabimon for unpaid taxes. He aimed to assert Nagamovi's dominance, continue his grandfather's legacy of gathering Menegamite lands, and fulfill his vision of Nagamovi as the second Delomon. The Nagamovi forces were well prepared for war, including diplomatically. All potential adversaries had existing truces in place: Cuderio Republic, Eudario and Naronion despotates, and the Sagamon Khaganate. On January 14th, 911, Nagamovi forces entered the Sarabimon lands via Guradovi. The army numbered around 30,000 men. The unit consisted partly of subjects of the Grand Despot, i.e. Delomons, but also included many Sagamons who joined the campaign in Sarabimon. The commander was Hera Canaron. This force did not aim to conquer, but moved swiftly through the land with the goal of plundering, looting, and killing. They passed through Sarabimon, including areas like Kumon and Gagogon, reached Zego and then moved on to Kuron, before returning across the Nagamovi border. By February 10th, the raiding party had left. They carried off significant riches. Another raiding party entered on February 23rd. Similarly, they moved quickly, burning, destroying, and killing. On March 25th, yet another party crossed near Viridot. They moved swiftly across Sarabimon, causing widespread destruction, especially around Naaman. The purpose of these raids, rapid incursions to devastate and then retreat, was to demonstrate superiority and strength, and to punish for unmet demands. Atagon V pulled back to observe how neighboring countries would react, and whether there would be significant protests. Sagamon Khaganate and the Cuderio Republic, however, did not react. The attacks revealed that Sarabimons were incapable of organizing resistance, which was nearly non-existent. Calls to organize resistance yielded no results. Sarabimons were accused of cowardice. Their military organization was outdated, and there was no unified leadership. Any resistance was sporadic and localized. The Sarabimon military force capable of being mobilized included Keri, dukes, who had become more administrative than militarily trained. The Republic could also call upon the cavalry of the nobility. However, nobles had few obligations to their overlord except one: to fight in wartime, though this obligation was not absolute. By the eve of the Sarabimon War, the nobility's cavalry service was among the most effective, with training and war games. By the Altarian Silver Age, mercenaries were widely used, but they required pay, making them expensive. Sarabimon lacked funds and manpower. The wealthy Sarabimon cities, Zego, Eratonion, could afford mercenaries. The cities also had their own defense contingents, where citizens were obliged to defend the city. The last group that could be mobilized were Sarabimon peasants, who were accustomed to farming and not combat-ready. Typically, they were not given weapons and were used for auxiliary tasks. By November 911, there were 4,000 cavalrymen in the Sarabimon army, 5,000 infantrymen, and 30,000 peasants in convoys and auxiliary roles. Sarabimon had 152 towns. According to warfare norms, a stronghold needed to be conquered. As long as it stood, the territory remained under the control of its original ruler. The biggest problem for Sarabimon besides the small number of men, was the lack of unified leadership and an authoritative figure to rally around. When Hera Kanaran left Sarabimon on February 10th, she left a message stating that the Grand Despot awaited the payment of tribute and would cease hostilities if it was paid. The Grand Despot was reportedly ready for a truce until April 20th. This sparked new debates in Sarabimon about paying the tribute. In mid-March, a diet of Sarabimon representatives convened in Zigo to discuss payment, but the challenge was collecting the money. Loans were taken, and funds came from personal resources, raising 60,000 demers. In late April, a delegation set out for Zeranon, but this effort failed. The reason was that peace could no longer be purchased. By May, the delegation reached the Grand Despot, but he rejected the proposal and refused the money. Instead, the funds were returned to Sarabimon and used by the Republic to finance its war effort. The Grand Despot no longer wanted peace because of an incident at Viridot. Viridot was an important Sarabimon fortress. We don't know who fired first, but around April 2nd, both Viridot and Karagatov accused each other. While archer fire was exchanged on April 2nd, a serious meeting took place in Viridot on April 5th to decide on the next steps. It was resolved to negotiate a separate truce with the Nagamovi to buy time and secure better terms. Two men, Kedomiron, a Viridot councilman, and Hediron, an Altarian merchant, were chosen for the mission. Kedomiron initially refused, citing his frequent visits to Zeranon and business connections, but ultimately had to go. They were instructed not to surrender the city and to buy time. They were allowed to offer an annual tribute from Viridot to the Grand Despot. First, they went to Karagatov and secured a 3-week truce. By late April, they reached Zeranon, but no negotiations took place. Instead, they were told that Viridot must voluntarily join the Nagamovi state, and no annual tribute would be accepted. The Grand Despot issued a charter of favor to Viridot on May 2nd, 911. Meanwhile, Sarabimon's leader, Master Menonidros, verbally supported Viridot but provided no real assistance. Lemenos, the commander of Eratonion, brought his forces near Boloyon. Despite these reinforcements, chaos ensued. On May 8th, a massive fire broke out in Viridot, reportedly starting in a barber's house. With strong winds, the fire spread rapidly through the predominantly wooden town. The Nagamovi took advantage of the fire, crossed the river, and captured the city. The townspeople sought refuge in the fortress and the moat but offered no organized resistance. The Nagamovi laid siege to the fortress and initiated negotiations. Ultimately, the defenders decided to surrender, knowing no reinforcements were coming and aware of their dwindling supplies of arrows and food. The negotiations proceeded peacefully. The Nagamovi promised that anyone who wished to leave Viridot could do so, and would receive a protective escort through Nagamovi lines. On May 15th, those leaving reached Boloyon, only to find that Lemenos and his forces had already departed. Help was neither coming nor available. A few days later, Kedomiron and Hediron returned from Zeranon with the Charter of Favor. The Nagamovi strategy during such conquests became clear: portray the cities as willingly submitting to the Grand Despot's rule. In the Charter of Favor, 20 Viridot citizens were named who would retain their prominent status in Viridot under the Grand Despot's protection, along with their rights and freedoms. This list was likely provided by Kedomiron and Hediron, as the Grand Despot would not have known these names. Viridot's council retained its authority, and the town remained under its jurisdiction, though the fortress was under the Grand Despot's control. Viridot residents retained religious freedom and were exempt from military requisitions. The Charter's most significant clauses pertained to trade and commerce. Foreign merchants could continue their business in Viridot and trade freely with Nagamovi. Viridot residents could trade throughout Nagamovi and in Altaria. They were granted complete tax and customs exemptions and unrestricted trading rights across Nagamovi. They could maintain relations with Altaria. The Nagamovi fulfilled these promises, as it was essential to show goodwill to attract other towns. However, Sarabimons accused Viridot residents of treason, citing the Charter of Favor as evidence of their willingness to join the Nagamovi state. They also pointed to the fire as evidence of betrayal. Viridot citizen Damon was specifically accused, as he had sent his belongings to Pokeron and allegedly told Lemonos not to send help. After returning to Viridot, Kedamiron entered the Grand Despot's service, continuing to conduct business in Viridot and managing Nagamovi trade in Altaria for about 2 decades. After the fall of Viridot, Nagamovi forces continued their campaign, targeting Buloyan as their next conquest. By late May, the troops reached Buloyan, where the fortress was weakly manned. Its defenders had fled. On June 6th, 911, Bulonian also fell. Smaller fortresses in eastern Sarabimon were similarly captured. The Nagamovi forces then moved towards Eratonian. Along the way, an important victory was achieved with the capture of Kumon Fortress on July 2nd. By July 8th, the troops reached Eratonian, and on July 12th, the Archer Fire began. The city showed a strong will to resist, with both the Kerry and the city council determined to defend it. However, after continuous Archer fire, the decision was made to negotiate with Hera Canaron. She had sent letters to the city, warning, "If you surrender, you will receive the Grand Despot's peace and mercy. If not, no child will be left alive." A delegation was sent to Canaron's camp, where he promised to cease the bombardment and offered peace if the city surrendered. He assured that Eratonian would retain its privileges and religious freedom, and those wishing to leave the city could do so. The delegation returned to Eratonian, and the Sarabimons outlined 40 demands for Canaron. Reportedly, Canaron had these demands translated into Delomonian and sent to Atagon V for approval, promising that the Grand Despot would honor them. On July 15th, 911, Nagamovi forces entered Eratonian. Eratonian citizens were not entirely spared from deportations. The first deportation occurred in late autumn 911, as Sarabimon attempted to retake the city. The largest deportation took place on September 10th, when nearly the entire Sarabimon population of Eratonian, about 2,000 people, was exiled to distant parts of Nagamovi. This was likely due to Grand Despot Atagon, the Fifth's suspicions of betrayal, stemming from the defection of Canaron, who had left the Grand Despot's service for Kudero Republic. The Grand Despot believed city residents may have assisted Canaron's escape. Another possible reason was fear that Eratonian citizens might surrender the city to the Kuderons. In eastern Sarabimon, fortresses were surrendered one by one, often already abandoned by the time Nagamovi forces arrived. The surrender of Gagagon was particularly notable. The Kerry negotiated a week delay to prepare for evacuation. During this time, he emptied the fortress, transporting all valuables and supplies to Zigo before handing it over. Despite this, he was later prosecuted and imprisoned for giving up the fortress. Efforts to reinforce Radion were quickly undertaken. Meanwhile, Hadaraton resisted Nagamovi forces thanks to Aurelionon, who organized its defense with just 50 men. This earned him the title, the Last Kerry of Sarabimon. Hadaraton's resilience was significant, as Nagamovi forces could not advance on Zego without first capturing it. In September, Nagamovi forces ceased active military operations for the year, with a significant portion of the army returning to Nagamovi. The Sarabimon Republic decided to exploit this lull. Under the leadership of Menonidros and Lemenos, intense preparations began, and by late September in Zago, the Republic began to mobilize its troops. For the first time, they managed to organize a substantial resistance effort. This force included approximately 8,000 mercenaries, 2,000 cavalry, and Sarabimon peasants. Skirmishes occurred near the walls of Eratonion, but the city itself could not be captured. Afterward, Sarabimon's forces began to plunder their own former territories. This scorched earth strategy would become a hallmark of the Sarabimon War. During the campaign near Eratonion, Menonidros was wounded and withdrew to Zago, leaving his troops behind. In January, the Nagamovi forces reached the outskirts of Zago, burning the suburbs to the ground. This was a show of strength rather than a sustained siege. In early February, the Nagamovi withdrew, and active fighting paused as a 5-month truce was declared. During the peace negotiations, Atagon V demanded that the Sarabimon's master travel to Zeranon to negotiate with him. A precondition for peace was that all Sarabimon fortresses be surrendered to the Grand Despot. However, these terms were not fulfilled, and no Sarabimon representatives appeared in Zeranon. Sarabimon looks for foreign allies. Sarabimons first sought aid from the Altarian Enorian in 912, after Nagamovi began making demands. However, the matter only gained traction during the convening of the Araton of the Altarian Republic of 909, where it was decided to allocate 50,000 gold areoles for recruiting mercenaries to defend against Nagamovi. This decision, however, was never implemented. Similarly, the 908th Araton promised 150,000 gold areoles, but these funds also failed to materialize. The Enorian issued calls for Valerian courts to pressure Grand Despot Atagon V to end the war and enforce a trade embargo on Nagamovi, though the effectiveness of these measures remains questionable. Ultimately, the Altarian Republic provided little more than diplomatic gestures. The Oravissa League presented a more tangible avenue for support. Atagon V's westward expansion harmed Oravissa trade interests. During the 910th League days, the Sarabimon crisis was discussed. Initially, there was an effort to offer economic aid. However, Atagon V declared Viridо the center of Nagamovi foreign trade in 911, bypassing Sarabimon intermediaries and significantly damaging Zago's economy. Zago's response was to engage in privateering, seizing ships and goods on the Felon Lake in 910. This action, however, angered Oravissa merchants, creating resentment and reducing the League's willingness to support Sarabimon. The reigning despot of Eudario Despotate was Varonian. His attitude toward Sarabimon was extremely negative, seeing them as unreliable. He wanted Eudario to stay completely out of the Nagamovi-Sarabimon conflict, following a foreign policy of maintaining good relations with Nagamovi, largely due to economic considerations. His second son, Keri Kuron of Zamagaton, was his favorite. Keri Kuron governed the Keriton, Duchy of Zamagaton. Ambitious and young, he sought opportunities to expand his territory, seeing the Sarabimon inheritance as a potential avenue for this in 911. Keri Kuron began investigating the situation in Sarabimon, employing spies to gather information. His actions displeased his father, who feared they could jeopardize Eudario's relationship with Nagamovi. Nonetheless, Kuron continued to act behind his father's back, showing a strong interest in expanding into western Sarabimon. In June 911, he made his first proposal to Radion, offering to place the city under his protection. This effort proved fruitless, as Radion responded that it was already seeking help from the Neronian Despotate, an Altarian vassal. Sarabimon, however, also began exploring relations with Kuron, realizing that negotiations with Varonian were pointless. Initially, Sarabimon sought 100,000 areoles in aid. But upon reaching Zamagaton's capital, the demand doubled to 200,000 areoles. In exchange, Sarabimon offered territories such as Hadaraton Castle, the town of Turon, and Penau as collateral. However, the condition was that the pledged territories would only be handed over if the loan could not be repaid. The sum was too large for Kerry-Curon, and when Varonian learned of this, he refused outright, calling his son's behavior childish and incomprehensible. Sarabimon eventually realized that Curon could not provide the necessary funds and sent a delegation to Varonian in 911. The despot maintained his position and refused any loans. However, Varonian began to consider what he might gain from Sarabimon. He countered with an offer to purchase Hadaraton Castle, which would allow Eudario to gain strategic control over parts of the Cateron Plain. Sarabimon declined this proposal. When Curon failed to gain his father's support, he turned to his elder brother, co-despot Zaron. Curon sought Zaron's help, offering to assist him in preparing for a potential marriage to Anaya of Altaria. Curon traveled to Altaria to help his brother establish contacts and pave the way for the marriage. In return, Zaron was supposed to assist Curon in Sarabimon affairs, particularly in mediating with their father. By 910, disappointment with Neronian despotate was growing in Radion. Various ideas emerged, including the possibility of seriously seeking aid from Eudario despotate. A significant shift occurred in September 910 when Varonian passed away. Cuderio Republic had a historical interest in Sarabimon, particularly southern Sarabimon, which had once been under Cuderio rule. As long as Menonidros remained Sarabimon's master, the Cuderio alignment prevailed. Cuderio Marshal Dadeco was particularly interested in acquiring the city of Pocoron, but Menonidros and Pocoron's representatives resisted this. Sarabimon proposals included annual tribute in exchange for protection, retention of privileges, and a clause allowing Sarabimon to buy back its freedom after the war. A crucial decision came during the Diet in Zigo in mid-July 910. It was resolved that aid would be accepted under various conditions, but individual cities would not be handed over separately. Assistance was to be provided for the entire region. On August 13, 910, Sarabimon and Cuderio signed a protection agreement in the Cuderio capital of Gordio, with the Cuderio Republic taking Sarabimon under its defense, in principle. A second agreement followed on September 15, 910. This agreement focused on the area near the Laseda Lake and Nagamovi, which the Cuderio Republic was to protect. Although the Cuderio Republic took control of 10 fortresses, including a 300-man garrison in Numeron, little was done initially beyond occupying castles. Marshal Dadeco was cautious, not wanting open conflict with Nagamovi. Over time, demands arose for control of additional fortresses, and by late 909 and early 908, all Sarabimon fortresses were under Dadeco's men. However, they initially focused on securing their position rather than actively engaging in the war. In Sarabimon, efforts continued to gather resources. In July 910, an extraordinary war tax was declared across Sarabimon to fund the defense. The year 910 was marked by stagnation and military failures for Sarabimon, as the Sarabimon War continued to weigh heavily on the region. Although a 6-month truce provided temporary respite, the Sarabimon Republic began preparing for a new campaign against the Nagamovi as the truce neared its end. However, the campaign was launched prematurely in late October, breaking the ceasefire. Despite initial success in field battles, the campaign failed to achieve its primary objectives. On November 15th, Sarabimon forces reached Eratonion, but their attempts to capture the city were futile. Eratonian's defenses had been significantly improved over the past year, making a siege ineffective. The decision was soon made to abandon the siege and redirect efforts toward Gagogon and Kumon. However, the attempt to besiege Gagogon Castle also ended in failure, forcing the Sarabimon forces to retreat. The campaign ended in disappointment, further lowering morale in Sarabimon. In early 909, Nagamovi forces launched a punitive expedition against Sarabimon in retaliation for the attack on Eratonion. On February 9th, they successfully captured Namon. After completing their campaign, the Nagamovi troops withdrew to their territory, sending a clear message to Sarabimon. Kuderio Republic, despite occupying key fortresses, would not engage Nagamovi forces. This realization deepened Sarabimon's sense of isolation and vulnerability. By June 909, Nagamovi forces began mobilizing again, gathering a significant army near the Sarabimon border. Sarabimon, instead of preparing a united front against this imminent threat, was plagued by internal disputes. These conflicts left the Sarabimon forces unprepared for the Nagamovi offensive. The Nagamovi advanced toward Radion along multiple routes. On August 1st, one of the Nagamovi units, advancing from the north, bypassing Hadariton, encountered a Sarabimon force led by Keri Quinton. The Sarabimon, vastly outnumbered, 1,000 versus 15,000, suffered a crushing defeat. Quinton was captured, and the loss further weakened the already fragile Sarabimon position. Eudario Despotet made a decision that would shape its future for a long time. While Varonion had done everything to make Eudario strong and successful, introducing reforms and avoiding foreign entanglements, his son decided otherwise. Eudario embarked on an expansionist foreign policy, becoming aggressive and stepping beyond its borders. In mid-June, a delegation from Radion traveled to Tyros, the capital of Eudario, to formalize the agreement with the Eudario's despot. On August 1st, 909, Despot Zaron ratified the terms of Radion's union with Eudario. From this date, the area officially became part of Eudario. However, Eudario's authority initially extended only to Radion and its immediate surroundings. Lands east of Penau and south of Hadaraton remained under Nagamovi control, and many Radionite nobles were hesitant about being under Eudario rule, preferring to wait and see which power would prevail. Effectively, Eudario control outside Radion and its vicinity was minimal. In Neronion, the development was met with displeasure. For the Neronians, despot Zaron had entered their traditional sphere of influence. Still, despot Venir refrained from taking any immediate action, and no conflict occurred at that moment. Magamon, the Keri of Kiptos and brother of despot Venor, was more belligerent, threatening to attack. However, he lacked the resources to follow through. The Kuderio Republic also disapproved of the shift in power. Despot Zaron was seen as infringing on Sarabimon affairs, as the Kuderio marshal considered himself entitled to the entirety of Sarabimon, owing to their protection treaties with them. However, Zaron was militarily stronger than the Kuderians at the time, leaving Kuderio unable to intervene effectively. From May, Kuderio Marshal Dedeco became actively involved in Sarabimon affairs, issuing orders to Sarabimon master Menonidros. The Kuderio marshal instructed Menonidros to hand over fortresses to the Kuderio Republic. By September, Kuderio forces began operating in Sarabimon. On September 10th, Dedeco issued a guarantee to the people of Pokaron and Eratonion, listing the rights and freedoms they would retain if they joined the Kuderio Republic. Menonidros sought to secure his position, requesting the title of Keri and a portion of Sarabimon for himself. In October, Kuderio representatives convened a diet in Gordio, inviting Sarabimon delegations, including Menonidros, Lemenos, and representatives from several towns, Pokaron, Eratonion, Hadaraton, and Zego. The negotiations proved challenging and dragged on until late November. There was no unified stance among the Sarabimon. The Sarabimon nobles became the main spokespersons, focusing on their class interests, religious freedom, retaining control of administrative positions, and securing inheritance rights for their estates. Zigo, however, pursued its own agenda, demanding religious and political freedoms. A major sticking point was Zigo's insistence on approval from the Altarian Enorian before aligning with Kudero Marshal Dadeko. The Marshal, on the other hand, demanded that Sarabimon follow the same model as Adrionic state in 915, when it became a Kuderio vassal. By mid-November, negotiations had reached a deadlock. Finally, on November 20th, Kuderio Marshal Dadeko proposed a compromise. Sarabimon would submit personally to him, not to the Kuderio Republic. This was accepted by Menonidros, the Sarabimon nobility, and representatives of Pokeron, Eratonion, and Hadaraton. Zigo, however, refused to commit fully, merely shaking hands in agreement, but not taking an oath. On November 21st, the majority of Sarabimon estates swore loyalty to Kudero Marshal Dadeko. Two key documents were signed on November 21st, 909 Dim Sarabimon, the submission agreement formalizing Sarabimon's allegiance to the Kudero Marshal, Dim Dadeko. The Kudero Marshal acknowledged the nobles' demands. In December 909, Menonidros reported the developments to the Altaria Enorian, justifying Sarabimon's submission as a necessary step due to the dire circumstances and lack of aid. On March 10th, 908, a formal ceremony in Zago marked the exchange of documents and oaths. Menonidros handed over the Sarabimon's archives, symbols, and castle keys, and released his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Menonidros was elevated to the status of Keri of Sarabimon, granting him rule over the Keriton of Sarabimon. This date is considered the end of Sarabimon. This marked the conclusion of the Sarabimon Republic's history and the effective partitioning of Sarabimon. The conflict evolved into a struggle over the inheritance of Sarabimon. Zigo initially retained semi-independence, with its privileges guaranteed by the Kuderio Marshal, but this autonomy was short-lived. Let us remember that north and northeastern Sarabimon was under Nagamovi control. On the account of Eratonian still being occupied by Nagamovi forces, a conflict was bound to happen. Radion was also under the command of the Eudario Despotate, which angered the Kuderio Republic, who saw all the lands being rightful territory of the Kuderio Marshal. By 909, relations between Naronian Despotate and Nagamovi Despotate were consistently polite and amicable, with no shared borders to cause tension. The two nations spoke of friendship, as there was no reason for hostility. In 908, Naronian Despot Odoki and Nagamovi Grand Despot Atagon V met, culminating in the signing of a friendship and neutrality treaty. Nagamovi declared it would not interfere with Naronian territories, recognizing all Naronian claims west of the Arno River, including Kuron. In August, Eudario representatives traveled to Zerenon to meet with Nagamovi authorities. With the death of Varonion, the previous agreements of truce between the two nations were deemed void, necessitating a formal reaffirmation of the peace treaty. Nagamovi officially recognized the Sarabimon territories that had been incorporated into the Eudario state. This marked a significant diplomatic step in Eudario consolidating its hold on these areas. However, by 908, Despot Zaran's mental illness had worsened to the extent that he was unable to govern the despotate for half a year. Zaran was overthrown and power passed to his brother, Keri Kuron of Zamagaton, who became Despot Kuron III. While Zaron maintained cordial relations with Atagon V, the ascension of Kuron III marked the end of friendly ties between Eudario and Nagamovi. Hostilities defined their relationship, culminating in the outbreak of the Nagamovi-Eudario War in 908. At the end of 909, Kuderio Republic and Nagamovi Despotate were bound by an existing truce. However, on November 21st, 909, the Sarabimon territories, represented by their estates, had sworn fealty to Kuderio Marshal Dadeko, effectively aligning themselves with Kuderio Republic. This led to hostilities between Nagamovi and Kuderio. The conflict escalated when Kuderio forces captured Buloyon from the Nagamovi in 908, marking the public start of the war. Initially, the Nagamovi advance was successful, as they quickly conquered several territories. However, as the war progressed, neither side managed to achieve decisive victories. In Nagamovi, a new deportation policy caused significant disruptions. Meanwhile, the Kuderio Republic side had little motivation to support Marshal Dadeko's personal campaigns, viewing the war as his personal issue. Additionally, Marshal Dudeko faced demands for internal reforms from the Kuderio nobility. Being elderly and lacking an heir, the Marshal showed little interest in addressing these concerns. Eudario entered the Sarabimon conflict with notable strength, outmatching Neronion and Kuderio militarily. Eudario took Sarabimon campaigns seriously, and by 908 they had launched significant offensives, taking Eratonion from the Nagamovi. At the same time, Nagamovi Grand Despot Atagon V sought to marry Anaya of Altaria to bolster his friendship with the mighty Altarian Republic. Altaria rejected this proposal. Instead, Despot Kuron III finally managed to pursue her. Negotiations culminated in their marriage on October 5, 908. Open conflict finally broke out between the Ayudario Despotate and the Kuderio Republic. The military events largely unfolded in the Sarabimon region and on its lakes. The conflict began as Eudario's actions dissatisfied not only Kuderio Republic, but also Neronian Despotate. Eudario's activities caused damage to all parties involved, leading to the formation of an anti-Eudario coalition. On one side, Kuderio Republic aligned with Neronion, and on the other, Neronion collaborated with Oravisa League. Neronion suffered due to Eudario's blockade of land trade to Zago. Oravisa faced similar issues, with Eudario forces seizing ships and cargo on the Felon Lake, which was connected to Zago via the Arno River. Gradually, these grievances united the parties against Eudario. By 908, the Kuderio phase had gone into full swing. At the start of 907, Grand Despot Atagon V decided to complete the conquest of Sarabimon, focusing primarily on southern Sarabimon against the Kuderio Republic. He had an agreement with Neronian Despotate. All territories Keri Magamon captured west of the Arno River would belong to Magamon, while eastern territories would remain under the Grand Despot's control. Nagamovi forces advanced with violence, whereas Magamon tried to achieve success through negotiations. Several fortresses voluntarily submitted to Magamon, including Kuron on August 3rd. Zago also submitted, though it was supposed to remain under the Grand Despot's control. The first significant confrontation occurred on August 20th, when the Grand Despot arrived at Buloyon. However, he was informed that the town was already under Kuderio's control. Enraged, the Grand Despot had the townspeople slaughtered, Kuderio's unit killed, and only one survivor sent back to Kuderio with a message. The Grand Despot wanted his share of the territory. On August 30th, the Grand Despot arrived at Hadaraton, taking the city. Although he captured the city, he was unable to seize the fortress. His force then moved on Zago, a city that was supposed to go under the Grand Despot, but had submitted to Keri Magamon of Kiptos. Magamon himself went to meet the Grand Despot, who berated him. However, during their meeting, an arrow fired from the fortress narrowly missed the Grand Despot. Furious, the Grand Despot ordered everyone in the fortress executed. The defenders, realizing their fate, decided to perform the Gadarikon by shooting themselves with arrows at the same time, escaping death at the Grand Despot's hands. From there, the Grand Despot moved on to Curon, executing everyone who had sworn allegiance to Keri Magamon. Magamon fled back across the Great Divide into Naronian territory, dying a year later in 906. By the end of 907, the exhausted Grand Despot halted military operations and returned to Nagamovi Despotate. However, a new chapter in the war began that winter as Cuderio Marshal Dedeco passed away. Stepanos, the new marshal, entered the fray, starting to reclaim Sarabimon territories. In 906, Stepanos continued his campaign and sought an agreement with Curon III of Eudario. However, the two failed to reach a consensus and refrained from direct conflict. The two nations only cooperated during the autumn of 906, when Nagamovi forces attempted to retake Eratonion. On October 20th, the largest open-field battle in the history of the Sarabimon War took place, with the Nagamovi suffering a devastating defeat near the fields of Eratonion. Despite their victory, the Eudario and Cuderio found cooperation difficult. The Eudario were particularly embittered by Cuderio's greed in dividing the spoils of war. The Battle of Eratonion is considered a turning point, marking the start of Nagamovi losses and a shift in initiative to the Cuderio Republic. Following their success, Cuderio forces advanced into northwestern Sarabimon. In 905, Stephanos reached Hadaraton, laying siege to the city, though he failed to capture it even if the fortress inside the city itself was still under Cuderio control. Negotiations began on December 10th, lasting a month. The Grand Despot was willing to relinquish much of Sarabimon except for Hadaraton, while the Cuderians demanded the entire region. The situation was saved by Eunos, an Altarian envoy whose mission was not only to negotiate peace, but also to bring the Nagamovi peoples under the true faith. To secure peace, Atagon V reportedly expressed willingness to discuss the subordination of the Nagamovi despotate to the high priest of Altaria. Eunos later described his task as reconciling fire and water, a mission he managed to accomplish, albeit briefly. In January 904, a 10-year truce was agreed upon. Atagon V renounced all his Sarabimon possessions. Grain was forbidden to be taken back to Nagamovi. The Cuderians were obliged to provide sufficient transport for the departing Nagamovi forces. The Sarabimon War, which began in 911, ended in a major defeat for Atagon V, who was forced to relinquish the territories he had gained. Exhausted from the conflict and plagued by internal issues such as economic difficulties, the destruction caused by the deportation uprisings, and personal losses, including the death of his heir, the Grand Despot's final years were marked by decline. Atagon V died in 855, leaving behind a weakened and fractured Nagamovi despotate.